Okay, I'm here today with Vince Emanuele, who is the co-founder of Park Media, a former Marine and a member of Veterans Against the Iraq War, or a former member, I believe, and has a YouTube podcast series on organizing, leftism, and working class issues. So, Vince, I first came across you when I saw your video about why people hate the left,
Mm.
which I really enjoyed as someone who's sort of a politically homeless leftist or whatever you want to call it. And then more recently, you did a video about cancel culture and the left, which was what made me think I've got to talk to this guy if I can. So I want to get into that and hopefully have a discussion today about sort of how wokeism or identitarianism has taken over the left. But could you start by just telling us about Park Media and the work you do there?
Yeah, so Park Media came about when the pandemic began because we had opened a community cultural center in Michigan City, Indiana, where I'm located right now, back in 2017. And we opened that center because there's really nowhere for people to come together, to hang out, to do different projects, other than like the local dive bars or the local chain restaurants and things like this. You know, we're in a deindustrialized area where a ton of union jobs used to exist and now they're gone. And the cities in which we live are like shells of their former selves. So we needed an area, we needed a space in this area where people could come together, do political work, cultural work. We had art installations, soup kitchens, everything from training on how to do expungements on like former felons, so people could vote and access loans, all the way to live music events, poetry slams, documentary film screenings, and guest lectures. So all of that ended when the pandemic started. And so we sort of switched over into doing some media to sort of keep the doors open. Instead of just asking people to donate to the space and not like give them anything in return, we thought it would be kind of neat to do a podcast and, like everyone else in the world, do a
Right.
podcast and a YouTube program.
Mm-hmm. And how has that been so far for you? You have a partner, right, Sergio?
Yeah, Sergio Kochergin, who's a longtime friend of mine. We served in the same platoon together, have been involved with various activist and organizing efforts over the last 15 years. And yeah, he's a co-founder of the space, moved to Michigan City back in 2016. And he's really does all the grunt work for the program. I mean, he does all the editing and the video, audio stuff, and anything that has to do with technology. So
Okay.
yeah, it's been good. It's been interesting. I mean, we're trying to figure out what is needed. I mean, there's so many different podcasts and YouTube programs. And I saw a video yesterday that a friend sent me of Russell Brand, the comedian, who did a video on like America's endless wars. And I was like, wow, like, you know, and it was like 400 or 500,000 views. I thought to myself, this is interesting. Like, even people like that are now like dipping their toes into the world of politics and talking about important issues. So I don't know. We're trying to bring a perspective that we think is not often heard. You know, like there's a lot of people in media from, not to criticize yourself, but from the West Coast, or from New York or Washington, D.C. And there's really not much like of a perspective of like, what are people in the suburbs doing? What are people in small industrial towns doing? What are people in rural areas doing? And what are their perspectives? How are they thinking about these issues? And we have enough real world experience of actually organizing people on the ground that we feel that we can offer, a service to people who are interested in learning more about the struggles and challenges of actually organizing working class people in a setting like Northwest Indiana.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's exactly what I observe, sort of that the discussion is centered on more elite concerns and things that, aren't really what I would consider the real important issues. I mean, endless war is a great example, right? It feels like no one talks about that. Yeah, how do you find the current conversation right now, sort of on the left?
Well, it's conflicted. I mean, look, I've been involved for the last 15 years now. When I first got involved, there were a lot of mobilizations. You know, we were in a different period in 2006 and 2007. You know, there were big anti-war mobilizations. Chicago saw the largest immigrant rights rally in the history of the city in 2006. Hundreds of thousands of people showed up. So there were all these big, massive mobilizations. We didn't have much electoral power or electoral influence. There wasn't much labor organizing going on. And I started to see some of this sort of identitarian stuff creeping when Barack Obama was elected. Now, I think there's sort of a careful way that we could discuss this, insofar as a lot of Black people that I knew were excited that Americans were willing to elect a Black president. However, there were people who used that as sort of an excuse to then allow Obama to do a number of things that I don't think we would have allowed another Democratic president to do. And so that was used as like a shield to protect him from legitimate critiques about the way he was treating whistleblowers, the way he was, his austerity politics, cozying up to Wall Street and corporations, extending and expanding Bush's war on terror. We can go on down the list of like all the horrific things that happened under the Obama administration. And a lot of times when people were levying these critiques at him, they were being told, hey, you need to check your privilege, or shut up because you're white and you don't have a place to say this. That kind of stuff was very unhelpful. So long story short, how do I see it today? Look, on one end, I'm happy because you have groups like, we have individuals like Bernie Sanders and AOC and Ilhan Omar and a whole number of other people who are now elected to office and now have a certain type of platform that they could, share these views with millions and millions of Americans. And that's a lot different than when I first came up. If someone talked about democratic socialism, you would be laughed out of the room like, what are you, you're crazy. That's never going to happen here. That's not something we talk about, whatever. That's a good thing. The bad part that I could see is that, some of this, like the cancel culture stuff, the rabid sort of online smear campaigns that go on where people just attack each other nonstop. Some of the identitarian stuff on the heels of what happened to Eric Weinstein in Evergreen State. All the way through, we saw this play out. I mean, I warned my friends, socialist friends, how this has played out in the real world. So it's like a lot of this, I think oftentimes people see it as like theory, like, oh, there's this theory about gender or this theory about this thing or race or whatever it is. And how I've seen it operate in the real world is that, it turns people off. Like when you focus on those types of issues, like nonstop, and when you attack people who disagree with you in really vicious ways, most ordinary working class people do not want to participate in left-wing political movements or projects that remind them of all of the worst elements of like their workplace, or maybe they come from an abusive family situation, maybe their domestic partner is abusive. Like if they're also seeing that in our movements and in our organizations, why in the world would they want to join them and participate? So that's a challenge. It's an ongoing challenge. Some of that I think is, yes, wrapped up with gender theory. Some of this is wrapped up with groups like Black Lives Matter. And a lot of this, there's a lot of like gray in between. I know a lot of activists who, what would you say, advocate for transgender rights, who are open to conversations with people who have different views on what that looks like, how that should be treated. But I also know people who are ready to like murder and have threatened to rape and literally threatened to rape and murder people for having these types of different views. And that's not helpful at all. So I think a lot of this, as much as I think it makes sense to intellectualize it to some degree, a lot of this, in my opinion, is like, is this how people operate in the real world? I don't think so. Like the things people say to each other online and the way that left-wing commentators and activists treat each other is not the way that anyone would treat each other, like in the day-to-day settings that we find ourselves in. Like it would totally be unacceptable. Anyway, that's a long, rambling response to a really simple question.
It's good. No, completely. I mean, like when we look at getting people fired, I mean, so I myself was fired for my tweets, which is sort of the origin story of why I'm out here talking. Yeah, that happened last summer. So, and it was, I was accused of transphobia, and so for sort of tweeting something negative about they, them pronouns. And I just see that whole movement as being so antithetical to class, to any kind of class consciousness or organizing. I've talked to now a lot of people who've also been fired for their speech. And there's just no understanding of like that, you're only really helping the upper classes when you do this sort of like snitching thing, right?
Yep. Yeah, I would actually like to hear more about your story. If you could give me like the quick
Sure.
version. So you just tweeted something about they and them, and that was it, huh?
Well, it was a little more than that. I had a whole Twitter account that was about these issues. That was like about, the feminist perspective of the gender issues. Well, I guess you'd call it the radical feminist perspective, meaning critical of liberal feminism.
Mhm.
And I had this as sort of a personal account. And then my professional account was connected to my work. And so someone tweeted to my boss, hey, this person has, this other account and she's a TERF, she's a vile transphobe. It was in the publishing industry. So it's very, very woke. So they said, no one work with this person, and then I was fired right away. It was a Sunday night and it was just over email within like 2 hours of that call out tweet being posted.
Yeah, that's very unfortunate, and I'm sorry that you went through that. I mean, I think this is the kind of, I don't know how to say this in a way that it will make it sound so elementary, but this is to me simply not how you treat each other. I mean, you just don't treat people this way, and I mean, I have a lot of political enemies, but I don't want to see any of them like homeless, or, I mean, wouldn't mind seeing Jeff Bezos homeless, but,
It'd be kind of
but
nice.
you know what I mean? But besides that, it's like, there's very few people in this world that I would want to see like without a job or without healthcare or any of these things. And you're so right that this approach to politics is antithetical to actually like getting working class people engaged with these movements, because anyone who lives in a working class area or around working class people sort of understands that a lot of working class people are not using the woke, pronouns or language, or don't have the sort of graduate school lexicon that people pick up after going to X amount of years of university. And that's okay. I mean, I do think, how do I say this? On the one end, because I live in Northwest Indiana, which is the opposite of the Bay Area, let me tell you. So on the one end, we don't deal with as much of this woke stuff, I think, as a lot of other people, like our friends in New York or San Francisco or wherever it may be. On the other hand, we have to walk a fine line where I live, because we do have people in our area who've been beat up just for the way that they look, and not just transgender people, but people who might dye their hair a different color or wear a rainbow shirt or whatever it may be. I mean, I'm talking gay people, lesbian people. Now, it's not rampant. So it's not like, everybody has to like carry a gun wherever they go if they're, if they consider themselves, not straight or whatever. But it is a reality here that we're dealing with like a rabid reactionary right wing that attacks women. So there's like tons of patriarchy from that. You have all the destruction that comes with that. We also have a ton of people who have like very xenophobic views. So that like we're trying to balance like not hitting people over the head with a sledgehammer if they say something that people don't like, which is a lot different than someone going to a local dive bar and beating up a transgender person because they're transgender. Like, if we can't separate those two, and if we can't like determine certain levels of like, oh, I might disagree with you, but okay, we agree on like people need healthcare, we agree on this, we agree on that. That kind of stuff to me is really out there. And I don't know, the last thing I'll say is that I don't think a lot of the people who behave like this, two things. I don't think they have a lot of friends outside of their small social circles. That's for sure, because if there's no way they could operate like that. And number two, I don't think many of them are engaged in ongoing organizing campaigns that involve working class people, meaning like getting people living wage jobs, fighting landlords that are kicking people out of their homes, trying to organize people who are unemployed, like, workers in warehouses. Like this is not, this is not the way that you reach out to people like that at all. And I don't think that most of the people who engage in this behavior are involved with efforts like that.
Right. I mean, we have sort of the keyboard warriors, right? Like the activists who that's all they do. That's their whole activism, is like calling people out or trying to get
Yeah.
people fired. I mean, and some of these people take it to a real extreme. Like there's some Twitter accounts that their whole goal is to get people not only fired but dehomed. And it's just awful. And like you said, even if I vehemently disagreed with someone, first of all, I wouldn't want to see them have that stuff happen to them. But even beyond that, it's like they could have kids, and they could, other people might rely on them, even if they really are a neo-Nazi, which, I've been called like a Nazi, which is hilarious because I'm Jewish. But yeah, and then I was gonna ask you about some people kind of predict a backlash coming against these minority groups who, like you said, they do still deal with this stuff, like real oppression stuff. And I think that's forgotten sometimes, is that it still is really hard to grow up like being a gay kid in the US and in many areas.
Yeah.
But even like there could be a backlash against, Black Lives Matter. Do you see that coming now because of all this? They've sort of overstepped their all this petty like squabbling and stuff.
Well, shit, where I live, it's already happened. I mean, how do I put this? There's a legitimate complaint and beef with the way that the police operate. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. When Black Lives Matter started to sort of, and well, this is another question. Is Black Lives Matter an organization? Is it a movement? I mean, there's real questions about like, how is this organization structured? Who makes decisions? How are those decisions made? Who comes up with the demands for the organization? Who comes up with the principles and the vision for the organization or the strategy? There does not seem to be a coherent answer to that. So it's really difficult because there were these demands like defund the police or abolish the police that were, proposed by, again, activists in Minneapolis or in Oakland or in New York that had very little relation to, say, a place like Michigan City, Indiana, where we don't have a municipal budget to defund. We don't have the resources to redirect from the police department to social services in a city that's 30,000 people with a shrinking tax base and revenue base. So that demand is right out the window right away. And even if you poll people, less than half of Black people agree with defunding the police. 13% of Black people agree with the idea of abolishing the police, according to the Gallup poll. So, much like the cancel culture stuff, I think that this is a minority of people who are extraordinarily loud and have a platform. And they have a platform now in these like liberal media institutions that love nothing more than to be like, we're woke. We've got, Black commentators and Latino commentators and all this kind of stuff talking about issues that, again, are not the priority to working class people. I'm trying to think of what's the best way to sort of follow up with that, because I don't want, on the one hand, it's like we face very serious issues right now. And so when I wake up in the morning or when we're thinking about what we're doing, we're thinking about like the fact that we have homeless people wandering down our street and that we have a huge drug problem where we live and that there are no jobs and there's no future, and the steel mill and the coal-fired power plant are like destroying our local community. So it's really hard for me, as much as I dip my toes into it and I'll make like short videos about why this stuff is totally out there to me. It's hard for me to, this conversation is making me think more about this than I normally do think about it. So even when I make those videos, it might be a response to like something that I've experienced. And I'm just like, hey, this is how I think about this thing. I try not to focus too much of my energy on the issues that'll be most divisive, other than to denounce the behavior. Because I think the more of us who step out and say, look, this is unacceptable, that I think that's good. But I think we run the risk of giving these people even more of a platform and allowing this cycle to continue if we're constantly responding to them all of the time. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that some of us, including myself, have not been good at, which is like, sometimes I'll see something or something will be said or written and I feel like I have to respond to it. But then I go to like my friend's house who works at the steel mill and my other friend who's an electrician, and they're like, the fuck are you talking about? Like, I never even heard of what you're upset about. And I'm like, okay, good. I'm like, well, shit, never mind then. I'm not going to talk about it anymore. Black Lives Matter, bad demands, bad strategy, not a clear organization that has a coherent mission or an objective, and the whole like politics of white guilt with this discourse of white privilege, totally not helpful. The left that I come from talks about talks about class, talks about universal issues like universal policies, not trying to make white people feel bad just for being born white. Like, this is crazy stuff. And as a result, where we live, the police came out in a better position than when the mobilization started. So there's more support today in Northwest Indiana for the police than there was a year ago, because people did not gravitate towards the Black Lives Matter movement. Like, there were a lot of people who came out in mobilization for it, and that was something to see. We live in a town of 30,000 people. We had over 1,000 people show up to the local Black Lives Matter event. The problem is, because it wasn't organized, because you don't have clear demands, it's a one-off thing. And then on top of that, after the event, you had a small group of people of that 1,000, maybe 50 or 100, who went off and smashed some store windows and this kind of stuff. Again, not strategic, not at all the types of tactics that you would use if you're really interested in bringing ordinary people into the mix. And there's all kinds of elements to that. Do older elderly people who live on Social Security and Medicaid want to go to rallies and events where people are smashing, burning, and breaking things? No. Do a lot of women want to go to those types of events? No. There's disproportionately men who are doing those things. So the breaking, the smashing, the vandalizing, the burning, disproportionately men engaged in that. Anyone who has children, you don't want to go to an event like that. If you're an immigrant, you don't want to go to an event like that because it poses a risk to you, especially if you're here illegally, that you might get picked up by the cops at this event and sent back home. Same for people who have criminal records. So like, all of the tactics that are used in this way that's supposed to be woke are actually the opposite of it, because it puts marginalized people at risk when you're doing those types of things. So anyway, again, a rambling response.
No, that's good. No, that's a really interesting point about how ordinary people mostly can't even engage in those types of things safely. But how do we do it? I mean, so you're an organizer, right? And you also educate people on how to organize. So yeah, how do you do it? How do you go into actual working class settings and organize?
Well, I think it's depends on who you are. I mean, I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and then we moved to Northwest Indiana when I was fourth or fifth grade. So I've lived in this community, or within 20 miles of where I'm sitting right now, for 5 or 6 years before I went to the Marine Corps, and for 15 years since I've been home from the Marine Corps. It's easier for me. Politics is all about social relationships, which is why, again, this sort of anti-social behavior of cancel culture and the sort of woke tactics that people use or whatever, like it's antisocial, and anything that's antisocial is not conducive to political organizing, because political organizing in politics is all about social relationships. Can you build social relationships and trust and bonds with people in your community? That's the key. I mean, the other key is finding organic leaders in the community. So who are the people in the community that everyone trusts? They're at your workplace or at your church, where at your social club, wherever it is that you hang out. Wherever you are, there's always a person or a group of people who are more trusted than others in that setting. So say you're working at a restaurant, there's probably someone on your shift who everyone kind of goes to if there's a problem, or it's like, hey, what's happening on this shift? Oh, well, ask Sarah, she knows everything, or ask Jim, he knows. Those type of people are the focus of a lot of those organizing efforts. There's a difference also between, so finding organic leaders, building social relationships, key. There's also a difference between structure-based organizing and self-selected organizing. So structure-based organizing would be looking at a definable geographic area or space, so like a workplace, that has a clearly measurable number of people that you're trying to organize. So a structure would be what they were attempting to do in Bessemer, Alabama, organizing a warehouse. That is a structure. Like, you have X amount of workers who work in that warehouse. It's a defined geographical area with a measurable number of workers that you can go to and say, okay, we got 2,600 workers at this warehouse. Right now, how many of them are with us? How do we test that? Well, let's test it through a simple petition. Okay, we're testing it through a petition. We got 56% of people even responded to the petition. and only 300 of those said that they're down with the union. They're with us. Okay, well, that's our starting point. Now we know that we have to bring another 2,300 people from that warehouse over to our side to win this unionization campaign. That's the same thing in a church. You know, what they did in the civil rights movement was to organize around structures. You know, there's like much of what people think of from the 1968 generation is like Students for a Democratic Society, Black Panthers, anti-war movement, and so on. And those movements existed, and, you know, to some degree or another, they did make change. But the movement that made the most change in that period was the civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement made the most change during that period. I agree with Jane McAlevey, who I think is sort of the best organizing mind in this country. That the reason that those victories took place was because they were actually organizing structures, and the structure that was being organized was Black churches. You know, going from Black church to Black church and saying, okay, we're going to organize these churches and get them on board for the civil rights campaign. And with a church comes a whole bunch of members. It's the same on a university campus. This is all different than, say, a group like Black Lives Matter, or a group like Occupy, or a group like Democratic Socialists of America, of which I'm a member. That is a self-selected organization. That's a what do I mean by that? That means that the people who sign up for that organization come to that organization because they already agree with the politics of that organization. In structure-based organizing at a workplace, at a church, at a university campus, the goal, and it's an absolute necessity if you want to win, is to change people's minds. So you're spending your time in a structure-based organizing context, talking mostly with the people who don't already agree with you. You're not spending all of your time in a social or cultural or political bubble with people who agree, just trying to come up with new fancy tactics. So like a lot of times, to use a real world example, you'll have like a small group of activists who come together. Let's say it's a Black Lives Matter chapter, it's 20 or 30 people, and they say, hey, we're going to keep doing different kinds of tactics and actions to try and get our point across or to try and make change, but they never grow. You know, a lot of times they get smaller. Well, a lot of activists then start to focus on tactics. You know, they're like, oh, well, it's not that our entire approach to politics is flawed. The phrase that we would use would be called the theory of change. So in the organizing world, the question is, what is your theory of change? If your theory of change is you get small bands of like-minded people together and you make as loud of noise as you can, I would argue that your theory of change is fundamentally flawed. If your theory of change is we're going to organize militant groups to have an armed insurrection in the United States and implement a socialist government, I would argue your theory of change is not based in reality and wrong. The theory of change we operate off of is that you need massive numbers of ordinary people to get involved with the political process in majoritarian numbers in order to make serious change. That you might be able to make change with minority numbers, but that the change will be short-lived and can be easily overturned. So we saw that in Bessemer, Alabama. You know, a successful union drive, more often than not, will have 80, 85, 90, 95% participation. And to get the unionization vote, you're looking at 75, 80, 85% yes votes out of that 90% of people of the total workers. These are big majoritarian numbers. This isn't just let's get a small group together and try and do some tricks and do some shortcuts and maybe we'll get the same result. No, these deep organizing efforts, especially structure-based organizing efforts, take a lot of time. You have to be rooted in the community. People have to know who you are. They have to trust who you are. You have to have real social relationships with people. Who's going to church with who? Who hangs out at the local dive bars? Who works there? Who are they connected to? Where do their partners work? Like, these are the kind of things that we're thinking about when we're doing organizing efforts. But the real important thing, I think, to keep in mind is the difference between structure-based organizing and self-selected organizing, and the difference between organizing and mobilizing. So much like structure-based versus self-selected organizing, mobilizing is about getting large numbers of people who already agree with you off the couch. So that's Black Lives Matter, that's Me Too, that's go down the list, that's the environmental movement, so on and so on. The difference between that and organizing is that in organizing, we're not just trying to mobilize people who already agree with us. In fact, most of our time is spent talking to people who disagree with us, trying to bring them to our side, and then mobilizing large numbers, majoritarian numbers of people strikes at the workplace. So where's the actual leverage? What kind of power do people have? A lot of the self-selected groups just try and use moral persuasion. We're going to get in the streets and we're going to make these politicians look bad, or whatever the case is. There's no real discussion about power and leverage. What kind of power do you have as a self-selected group of Black Lives Matter activists in your city? Very little power, other than to maybe disrupt business as usual, which can also backfire against you, or to embarrass politicians who more often than not probably don't give a shit what you think anyway. When you're doing structure-based organizing, especially in the workplace, it's like, well, what kind of power do workers have? The ultimate power workers have is to go on strike. Easier said than done. A lot of people will be like, hey, general strike because we don't like the rent, whatever, or there's going to be a rent strike or whatever it may be, or there's going to be a general strike. You'll hear like fringe left-wing groups make these announcements. Well, it turns out it's much more difficult to go to an apartment complex where 200, 300, 400 people live, and to get more than half of them. And even if you get more than half of them to agree to a rent strike, maybe that's not enough. Maybe the landlord is willing to kick out 50, 55, 60% of the residents because the demand for housing is so high that it doesn't matter if 60% of residents don't pay rent. Okay, well, if you don't have 80, 85, 90, 95% of people in that housing unit on the same page with a coherent message and a plan of what to do if the landlord carries through with kicking all of you out, you're setting people up for failure, and you're also setting people up for big disappointments. And those are like two of the things that are very frustrating as an organizer to see, is that a lot of this is like setting people up to feel disempowered, which we don't need. It's already tough enough to organize. You get your teeth kicked in more times than you win. So let's try to get people to not make the same mistakes that so many movements and organizations have made in the past, including ones that exist right now.
Yeah. And, when you talk about the strikes, I mean, it reminds me, I used to be a part of a socialist organization like a few years ago. And I ended up leaving because they weren't very tolerant of like dissenting views. Surprise, surprise. But, one of the things that I learned was that in, historical strikes in this country, one of the best tactics, the most effective tactics of ruining the strike, of breaking the strike, was to simply give some perk to like the white strikers, the white workers, as opposed to the Black workers. And then you've divided them, because if the white workers accept it to sort of better their own lives a little bit, you've completely, divided any solidarity they had. There's going to be a lot of resentment. There's going to be, just like you talked about, the social bonds are going to be broken. And I do kind of see that today with the identity politics. I mean, it's benefiting, like you said, it's benefiting the corporate world, and you can have tokenism and you can look really progressive and great, like you're including everybody. And there's the whole training, anti-bias training, like white fragility, Robin DiAngelo, she's been enriched this past year. And what has she done? Like, how is that? How has that helped in any way to sort of, spread these like universal values that you're talking about, getting people together?
People better know what they want when they say things. So in other words, if you're going to call yourself any kind of activist, whatever it is, and this goes even for our radical feminist friends sometimes, who, also I think can sometimes turn people off if they sound like Black Lives Matter activists. So it's like, you have to have a political program. So when I hear people like, yes, I think racism is an issue in the United States. Systemically, I think there's ways to measure that, which is a lot different than these interpersonal forms of racism that then people focus in on, which is like, are you using the right language? Did you slight me in this conversation? Did you talk over me because you're white? Like that, those kind of like what that were used to be called microaggressions, that cartoons like South Park and The Simpsons made fun of. Like that kind of stuff, very unhelpful. So when you tell people, or when my friends who are into what would be called anti-racist politics, I have like the most simple question for them, which is, what is the program for anti-racist politics? That's it. I don't get into like all the maybe nitty-gritty debates or theoretical discussions that people are having around critical race theory, et cetera, et cetera. Not really my interest. My interest as an organizer is more, okay, there's a problem. We live in a city that's 30% Black. We live in a region in Northwest Indiana that's disproportionately Black compared to the rest of the state, with some cities that have a majority or plurality Black population. Most people would agree that they experience different forms of racism, but most people here would also agree that, like, most of the Black people we know, like the overwhelming majority of our neighbors and friends and people who come to the community center here in Michigan City or in Gary or elsewhere, are not interested in making white people feel bad. They're not interested in, like, going to white people and being like, I'm going to take out my anger on you, and I want you to change your language, and you're the reason why my neighborhoods are falling apart because you don't understand, how oppressed I am as an individual or as a group of a collective group of people. Very few people want that. So it's a weird contradiction that Black Lives Matter does not speak for the majority of Black people that I live around. So and furthermore, we live in a city, again, that's 30% Black, and we don't even have a Black Lives Matter chapter in the city of Michigan City. So that's like how little some of this resonates. And we live 50 miles from Chicago. So people might be hearing this and going, Northwest Indiana, like, where's this guy in the middle of a cornfield? Like, 20 miles south of me, you will be in the middle of a cornfield. Where I live is one of the most industrialized areas in the United States, even today. We have a tar sands, or an oil refinery that refines tar sands from Alberta, Canada, and East Chicago. U.S. Steel, ArcelorMittal, which is now Cleveland Cliffs Steel Mill. Like, this is the area that we live in, but it's also, it's very rural if you go south of here. None of the Black people that we work with did this, like, national movement of Black Lives Matter have a real impact. Furthermore, and I need to say this, in the city of Gary, Indiana, a city that used to have 200,000 people, now down to 80,000 people, 85% of whom are Black, the Blackest city in the United States, with that population, did not have one major mobilization during the George Floyd protests. It is the Blackest city in the United States, and people living, and people be like, oh, well, Oakland or these other areas. It is nothing like Gary, Indiana. Gary, Indiana has been through a level of deindustrialization and deinvestment that almost no other area in the United States has experienced. There's a few pockets, but very few. So that gives people, like, for us, you might see all these things on the news or MSNBC or YouTube or whatever, but in our day-to-day reality, the impact that Black Lives Matter has had, not much in our communities. And so the question I think people have, that's a roundabout way to just say to people, the question people have to ask themselves if they're going to, say this is an issue or that's an issue, what is the program behind it? You cannot beat people over the head with, white guilt, and think that that's going to result in better politics. You have to have a program. You have to say, hey, our program for anti-racism in the United States is we need a housing policy in Black communities. We need universal health care. We need X, Y, or Z. We want these specific reforms to the police that a majority of Americans do agree with. The majority of Americans want the police not to have tanks and, the kinds of assault weapons that we had in the military. Like, people want those changes. People want more accountability for officers who behave badly or who do horrific things. People want that. Well, use that as a stepping stone to actually gain some reforms that people agree on. And, that's the only way that we're going to actually make changes. Anyway, I don't want to keep going on, but it's the same with any issue. If you tell people, you keep beating people over the head with the planet is being killed, which it is. The planet is in terrible shape. Our ecology is being destroyed, and it's been that way for many, many decades now. But if you just leave people with feeling bad about it, or just showing them pictures of forests being torn down and, polar bears that look like skeletons sitting on an iceberg somewhere.
Right. And Greta Thunberg speeches, of course.
It doesn't do anything, it just makes people feel really bad. And people already feel really bad and really depressed. All the polls show, all the statistics show, most people are, like, alienated, lonely, don't have purpose in their life, don't have a meaning for what they're doing, are disproportionately taking antidepressants, disproportionately taking opioids. Like, people already know things are really fucked up. So if you just keep bashing people with like, you should feel bad because of racism and you should feel bad because the environment's bad, is not helpful at all. Like, you have to have a program for people, and we have to focus, I think, most of our energy and anger and venom on the people who are really responsible, people who are really in positions of power, not like someone who works for a university or a publishing company, but like people who own, Amazon, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Donald Trump, like Joe Biden. These are the people who actually have real political power in society. And I think those are the people we should be focusing our energy on. And we have to have like clear vision and clear objectives to do that. Otherwise, we're this is all just a performative exercise. And, that's, again, not interesting to poor and working class people who are, waking up, working 2 or 3 jobs, trying to get their kids to school, pay for childcare, wondering if they're going to pay off their cell phone bill, their student loan debt, or their medical debt this month, and trying to make difficult choices in between. They don't have time for performative bullshit. And that's why you don't see so many poor and working class people, thankfully, get involved with these kind of identitarian things. Now, you catch one here and there, but very few of them have the time for that kind of shit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the performative aspect is just run amok, hasn't it? I mean, it's just completely out of control. It's like sort of upper middle class white people can feel good about reading Robin DiAngelo or talking about their white privilege, and talking about equality of outcomes. It's something I've noticed a lot, that it's not about equality of opportunity, it's about equality of outcomes. And actually, I want to run past you, this thought I had about that. If we focus on equality of outcomes instead of equality of opportunity, isn't that kind of like a top-down way of looking at things? Like, okay, we could have a CEO who's Black, or we could have a board that's half Black, half white, or half women, half men, whatever. But doesn't that distract from the actual bottom up? I mean, if you're talking about equality of opportunity, you'd have to help everyone who's at the bottom just get what they basically need in life. I mean, that just struck me as something that's a further distraction. Like, look over there instead of at the real issue that the populace needs. I don't know what you think of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have heard this sort of debate taking place more and more about, I think different people mean different things. So I think if what I'm hearing you say, which is like, if the equality of outcome is simply like replacing more people at the top with people who just are more representative of the population as a whole, then no, I mean, I obviously disagree with that 100%, or I agree with you and disagree that that's like the way to go. I don't know. It's interesting. How would I say this? As far as outcomes are concerned, I think I'm weary of going too much into that, because it to me seems like a really deep discussion about what people think certain types of socialist politics are about anyway. So some people will say, oh, socialism, you want every single person to live in the same house. When what I'm saying when I say socialism is, I think we have the knowledge, capacity, resources in this society to make sure no one goes homeless. That is a different thing, though the outcome, so we don't want the same outcome for everyone. I think more equity would be good. In other words, I don't think it's good. And I think there's plenty of historical examples to show that, like, when you have an oligarchy or when you have extreme income and wealth inequality, that it's not good for a nation, and that it usually leads to really bad things for a society as a whole. Does that mean that every single person should be like working the same jobs, wearing the same things, like living in the same size home, or having the same access to every single thing? No, I don't believe in that at all. But I do think we have the resources, and this is where I would like I'd be very interested to talk with people who are like, I see people who are very fired up about this concept of equality of outcomes, because I don't know how much of that is like real and how much of that is a perceived thing that's happening. In other words, I know that there's identitarians out there who are like, we just need more women and Black CEOs and we'll be good. So that's real for sure. But I don't know too many of my socialist friends who like over and over again will say, we think that the outcome for everyone should be the same. It's like, no, like part of this is how much work you put into it. Maybe we have some kind of a democratic agreement in society about like, what is a reasonable level of wealth? Like me personally, I don't really care if there's people who live in like mansions on the beach. The question is, if you own 6 or 7 or 20 mansions, are you like, warping the housing market and making it more difficult for other people to live in like affordable, reasonable housing because you're now speculating and buying up properties all over the country? Like that's a reasonable debate. Yeah. Anyway, I don't know if that is that clear. It's really interesting having this discussion with you today or answering these questions, because with everything that's been going on lately, it hasn't been something I've been thinking about. But as you're bringing this stuff up, I'm thinking to myself, yeah, these are the conversations a lot of people are having since the pandemic. I mean, especially I've heard more and more people talk about like equality of outcome, equality of opportunity. What worries me about the equality of opportunity stuff is that I'm with you. I think you have to start at the bottom and you have to figure out like, what do people actually want? And then, scale that up into like policies, laws, structures. But it worries me. Part of the discourse around the equality of opportunity stuff worries me because I feel like it can also fall into this very sort of right-wing stuff about like the Horatio Alger myth. So it's like,
What is that?
So Horatio Alger is like this idea that if you work hard, you'll get what's coming to you, that we're in a meritocracy in the United States, that the people who have a lot in this country and the people who have done well, they've done so because they're so smart and so nice, and they've done it in such a good way that's why they're in the positions they're in.
Okay.
And that worries me because I do hear a lot of people saying, oh, people need opportunities. But what if you give them those opportunities and things still don't work out? Like, do we then fall back on this like, oh, it's all your fault, like you've made terrible decisions in your life? And that, again, might be true to some extent, but like I've made a lot of bad decisions in my life. We can't like anecdotally go case by case. We have to look at the data, and the data shows that in the United States, we're going to be the first generation that lives at a lower standard of living than our parents did. It also shows that the United States is like, I think either number 1 or 2 now in the world for the gap between like where you grew up and your opportunity to get into a higher social class. Like in the United States, in the UK, those are the 2 nations where you are born is likely where you're going to end up. So if you were born lower class, there's a really good chance you're going to die in the lower classes. This is crazy because these are the 2 countries, the UK and the US, that pride themselves on being meritocracies more than any other virtually any other place in the world, but definitely any other countries in the West. And yet they're the 2 countries where no matter how hard you work, you're more likely than not end up in the same position that you were in when you were born. So there's big discussions about how society is structured, the state apparatus, how it shapes capital, how capital functions, development, education, technology, logistics, climate change. Those are real important issues. Public education, that's the kind of stuff that, to me, people who are interested in making political changes or connecting with ordinary working class poor people, those are the issues they should focus on, because those issues, resonate with people who are just barely scraping to make it by day to day.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're running out of time, but lastly, just where do you want people to find you? Where should they go online to find your work?
I was going to say, where can they find me? 1713 Franklin Street in Michigan City, Indiana, because that is where...
Are you going to dox yourself?
We live in Indiana, so for anyone who's listening to that and might think any squirrely ideas, you can own any kind of weapon you want in Indiana. And I live with a scout sniper, and I'm a former machine gunner. So like, please come by the house if you want to cause problems. Anyway, that's kind of a joke, but not really a joke. So I say that the address because we do have a space. So for better or worse, for Sergio and I, like, we have dealt with some harassment, but not much. We do have a space, and we're going to reopen this space. And when we did interviews in the past, like, I know it's the digital era. So now, check out parcmedia.org, PARCmedia.org. You could check out Politics, Art, Roots, Culture on Facebook. We have a Facebook page that we use. You could check my work out at Vince Emanuele on Twitter. But most importantly, if and when hopefully soon the pandemic sort of passes or people are able to get out and about more, if you're watching this and you're within driving distance or you feel like paying a visit, come and see the community cultural space here in Michigan City, and we can show you like on the ground, real world, what we do day to day, what it looks like, and the challenges we face, and hopefully.
Enjoyed getting to talk to you.
Yeah, same here. Thanks for inviting me.